Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to take a closer look at these 7,000 lorries that Michael Gove would say will be stuck in queues as a result of his Brexit scheme this January. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, I've touched on Michael Gove's leaked letter regarding Brexit delays in and around Dover already, in discussing the concept of an inland border around Kent. But this time what I'd like to do is actually take a bit of a closer look at this impact of his discussion of queues, delays to 7,000 lorries. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use an average of, let's say, about 18 metres for the length of a lorry. And they vary, of course. And even nose to tail in sort of gridlock, it's going to be a small gap between them and the lorry in front of them. So I think 18 metres for the lorry in the gap, I'm confident, is not an overestimate. If anything, it would be slightly on the short side there. So 7,000 lorries, taking that 18 metre length average, would be a snake 126 kilometres long, or just under 80 miles. 80 miles. This is what Michael Gove is talking about. Yes, due to Brexit, we're going to have 80 miles worth of lorries just stuck, just not going anywhere. And even if the approach to the port of Dover were, say, a 3-line motorway for enough miles, you'd still be talking over 25 miles of total gridlock. Now, at this point, you can see why the government are building all those lorry parks. You can't just gum up dozens of miles worth of main roads leading up to your most important port. Kent would be at a standstill. And this is where the people of Kent really need to be contacting their MPs and giving them a very hard time, because MPs in Kent tend to be the pro-Brexit conservative variety. So they don't get a pass on this. And yes, I know that means that people of Kent voted for these people, sort of their fault. But I mean, blame is useless, and also not everyone is to blame. Not everyone voted for them. But the point is that those MPs, those Kent-based MPs, are actually complaining at the government, their own government, for building these lorry parks. Of course they are, because local residents are not at all happy about them. But given that the alternative is that roads in Kent are completely blocked, impassable for people who are just trying to get to work, or even for lorries who are not necessarily going to Dover, they're just delivering things to shops and supermarkets. So what I would like people in Kent to do is to contact their MP and say, so what would you do then? What would your idea be? Don't just complain about what the government are doing. Say what you would do, because I wouldn't be letting these MPs get away with complaining about a solution without offering an alternative themselves when they voted and campaigned for the problem in the first place. Because from my point of view, if someone was going, well, Phil, what's your alternative then? I'll tell you what my alternative is: not leaving the customs union with the EU. That's my alternative. But these are people who voted to leave it. Right then. So you created the problem. You come up with a solution. You shat the bed, you clean the sheets. Don't let them just complain at others who are doing that while they carp from the back benches. And I've had a number of people sort of ask me, so what about other ports around the country? It's not all about Dover. So I live quite close to Hull, for example. And all I know there is that the port authorities are not at all happy that they're being given enough information or guidance from the government. There's also talk of a lorry park for there as well, to stop roads around Hull being gummed up. But I mean, I don't know about Liverpool or Holyhead or anywhere else, but I suspect it's much the same. But Kent, of course, is by far the biggest problem, easily, because it's a county that is host to Dover, which is by far and away our most important and the largest trading port, and also Folkestone, which is where our end of the Channel Tunnel is. Now, given that Michael Gove cannot even manage the situation in Kent, I can't imagine he's diverting too much attention, if any at all, to other ports around the country. So I think it's fair to say that chaos won't even come close to covering it this January. And then just to throw something else into the mix. So I was reading a blog by Naomi Smith, who's a prominent pro-EU campaigner. And she astutely noted that Gove is calling this 7,000 lorry queue a reasonable worst case scenario. Now, from my point of view, I focused on that worst case scenario thing when I was discussing this in a recent video. So what I was saying is, you know, people may think because it's the worst case scenario, this 7,000 lorries, that that's the unlikely end of the scenario. That's not the case. Worst case scenario doesn't mean unlikely. It just means what it says, that of all the scenarios you imagine, this one is the worst. But the worst case scenario can be the most likely as well. If I jump off a cliff, the worst case scenario may be considered that I die. But this is also the most likely scenario. So what Naomi Smith was pointing to was the use of the word reasonable. That was her focus. So reasonable worst case scenario. So what if a lot of events all line up into a perfect storm to deliver an outcome that on the face of it doesn't have a high likelihood but could still happen? Because you're talking about, obviously when you're talking about, oh, if this happens and then this happens and this happens, and there's a whole chain of maybe 10 things that all have to happen for the scenario at the end of it to occur, which could be a really terrible scenario. But you wouldn't call it a reasonable scenario because you're requiring 10 things all to line up, 10 ducks in a row. But let's say this did happen. So how long would the queues be then? Because reasonable worst case scenario is not actual worst case scenario. It's of all the things that are reasonably likely. So what she pointed out was last year the government worked on the reasonable worst case scenarios and they called this Operation Yellowhammer. We've seen it. Initially it was leaked and then the government were forced to publish most of it. But there was also Black Swan. And this was the real worst case scenario where pretty much everything went wrong. Imagine what if every little thing went wrong. What would happen then? Now, at the time, we imagined the Black Swan outcomes, which included a state of almost total anarchy in the country, never mind a few isolated riots. But we supposed that that was an unlikely scenario. That was what that was intended to be. Black Swan, unlikely, but Bayek, if it ever happens, ooh, don't even want to think about it. But then you look at Boris Johnson's government and you look at how they've managed to make a mess of literally everything they've had to deal with this year. The floods, the early response to COVID, where we got way more time than others to prepare, but we still locked down too late. We abandoned testing. We were using test and trace, all this talk about test and trace. We were using it and it was working. And then we decided to abandon it. And then later on, we had to try and reinstate it. But by then, the situation we found ourselves in, it was too vast for test and trace to get a handle on it. And that is still the case now. Forging on with an app that everyone said couldn't possibly work before abandoning it and then going with a different one many months later, which still has aspects of it that people are saying, will you stop? You know, messing up exam grades when they could have learned. You could argue they shouldn't have made that mistake in the first place, but if they were going to, and mistakes happen, they made exactly the same mistake as Scotland. Why didn't they learn from people making mistakes before, when they still had time to change the scenario? Because again, in England and Wales, we were ahead of the curve there, or behind the curve, sorry. So we saw what was happening in Scotland. We should have gone, yeah, it's not worked out well for them. Should we change? No, let's forge ahead. All right, but we're going to have to change, you know. Yeah, no, we're not. All right, we're going to change now. And you know, all the rest of it, we've had... we've pissed off the entire world with our threats to break international law. Boris Johnson literally nearly killed himself with his idea of leadership. You know, everything that he and his government have done has been messed up. I cannot really point to too many successes. The only success I can think of was the initial job protection scheme, the furlough scheme. And even that was devised completely separately to government. That was devised by senior civil servants who, without being told to, by the way, who just predicted that it was going to be needed. Now, to be fair, the government could have said no and they didn't. So you could put that down as a government success. That's the only one. So, you know, if we're sort of going to be told by one of Johnson's monkeys that there is a reasonable prospect of 7,000 lorries being taken out of action and stuck in delays in or around Kent. But this same monkey is expecting businesses to prepare, because that's what his letter's saying. He's saying you need to prepare, otherwise it's your fault. But he's expecting these businesses to prepare without telling them what to prepare for. Because like the Road Haulage Association, for example, saying, well, oh, go on, tell us then, what do we do? What do we prepare for? There's no answer to that. So if his figure of 7,000 lorries is based on businesses preparing for customs declarations that anyone other than the oldest of them will never have done in their lives, without even telling them what to do, then what will the real figure be like? Or what if Michael Gove, when getting this figure of 7,000 lorries, was telling his officials to consider optimistic outcomes? What then? What if it's 10,000 lorries? It's 112 miles of gridlock. 15,000 lorries, that's nearly 170 miles. And the world, you know, with all these delays that we talk about, so that the term delay hides a lot as well, really, doesn't it? Because a delay could be something that eventually gets sorted out. Oh, well, it'll just happen for a few days and then we'll know what we're doing and we'll sort it out. But we can have permanent gridlock here. And what if that happens? And the only way of sorting it out, the only way of ending the blocking of roads in Kent, and potentially elsewhere, is to get a free trade deal with the EU, which I'll remind people doesn't stop the checks. The checks would still have to happen. We've known the checks need to happen for years now. But it will make them easier. What will be the political dimension if the only way out of this mess, if there's no way of dealing with it, the only way out of it is for Boris Johnson and his government of Brexiteers to go crawling to the EU and beg for another transition period type arrangement, because there will not be time to actually negotiate anything different. It'll just have to be a carbon copy. Can their egos take it? Because look at the situation with Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle. All Dominic Cummings had to do was apologise. That was it. Yes, people like myself would have been saying it's hypocrisy that he didn't resign when others did, but it wouldn't have been nearly as damaging. It would only have been the Conservatives' political enemies calling for this. Their own supporters would have gone, well, he's apologised, let him off. You know, all he had to do was say sorry and it would have all blown over. But his ego could not take admitting that he was wrong. So he had to concoct the idea that, oh yeah, so what happened was I thought I was blind, so obviously the reasonable thing to do is to pack my young family into a car and drive into the middle of nowhere. So what are they going to do rather than admit to being wrong if we end up with total gridlock in Kent? How much damage is the government going to do to this country because their egos will not accept admitting that they were wrong? How many haulage companies are going to go under? How many other businesses? But there it is. Those are some more thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.